Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sprint 189 review. The sprint ended on June 13th. It was a normal 2-week sprint. I'll start with the overview. Jeffrey will follow that up with the UI, Adam on providers, Joe on the platform, and Keenan with the rest. As you can see, sprint rate 189 had a little less activity. A lot of that was because we were focused on mostly bug fixes and trying to stabilize the Nydorf branch. And you can see the numbers by label here. You can see there's a lot of bug fixes, a handful of enhancements, and a very small sprinkling of the rest. And over to Jeffrey for the UI.
Hey, good morning. In this sprint, 16 PRs got merged in UI Classic repo, out of which 13 are bugs and 3 others. These are the PRs that got merged, and I can explain about them in the following slides. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is a list of PRs related to translation bug fixes. And the first one, translation updates. Melody applied I18N rules to many strings and fixed an SVT issue related to translations. Next one, fixed pagination translations. Gilbert fixed a missing translation issue for the pagination bar in the data tables. The third one, Melody removed interpolation across various sections of code as these were not conductive to I18N rules. The fourth one, Joe updated the English JSON translation file related to Melody's PR, the third one mentioned above. The next one, Joe updated or removed few translation files with reference to a dependent PR in core 21926 to fix translations for the defective strings. And the final one, Joe had also fixed some conflicts related to translations from Angular conversion that occurred on master, but not on Nydorf. Next slide, please. An issue was reported about not being able to provision the VMwares since there were no VMware templates and provision request based on the selected template list. That's because the provision cloud templates were being loaded instead of the provision infra template. And fixes were made in this PR and were able to provision the VMwares. Next slide, please. Another issue was also reported regarding the translated strings in data table headers being vertically aligned, especially for the Chinese and the Japanese translations. So this was fixed by applying a small CSS change. Next slide, please. The catalog information was missing before. Gilbert had fixed this issue in the catalog summary page. Next slide. So this PR is related to a GitHub action failure, which occurred when a dependent PR got merged first. This issue was fixed by removing the corresponding entry from the routes.pending.yml. Next slide. Again, these PRs are related to fixing the GitHub failing actions. Added provided the fixes for the spec files under the storage controller and the chart layout service. Next slide. 2 technical depths PR were also merged. Nasser removed a lot of mixin related actions to related to the VMs, and Gilbert removed old Angular code for the empty chart present in cloud provided dashboard charts. This was removed because this was already converted to a React component. That's all from my side. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Jeffrey. So for providers of the sprint, in core, Vincent changed the host to allow it to control what performance charts are shown for CPUs, specifically whether the provider brings CPU usage percentage or megahertz. This is something which is already being done for VMs, so he just added this to the host model as well. We also replaced the host validate IPMI with supports feature to reduce the confusion on the name of the method, since it matched the old availability mixin, but it wasn't actually used in that way. For Amazon, the automated workflow updated the instance types to pull in new instances twice this sprint. So we got those up to date with what Amazon has available. For Azure, we are following what we did last sprint for VPC and delegating the refresh action from the network manager up to the cloud manager. Azure didn't have the same bug that VPC did, but we're just working on moving this to be consistent across all the providers. For Google, we updated gem dependencies for Fog Google and then Google Auth and Google API client following that. There were some VCR spec changes that we had to make to be able to update these. We had pinned a version of Google Auth to allow for Faraday 1.0, but that was limiting us from being able to upgrade any further. So by removing that, we're able to pull in newer versions of all these gems. Next slide. For Power VS, they updated the native console URL method to return a more specific URL. Previously, it was just bringing you to the main cloud.ibm.com page, but they're making use of the service UID that we have to be able to bring you directly to your Power BI instance in the web browser. Kuldeep also finished his work on collecting server placement groups to make use of these as part of provisioning in the future. And we also supported clone to template provision workflows for Power BS. For VPC this sprint, Nasser persisted the username of the user who initiated events as part of the activity tracker service to make it easier for us to find out who is initiating various actions as part of VPC. And for Power HMC, Vincent implemented which types of CPU are being collected for the hosts in Power HMC. So that we're only showing CPU charts showing, I believe, megahertz for the HMC provider. And Caliste added power operations for physical servers, so you can power on, power off, and reset those servers. Next slide. For Oracle Cloud, we added proxy support for Oracle Cloud. The settings were there, but they weren't being applied to the gems. So we're now applying those to the SDK, so you can use a proxy to reach your Oracle Cloud. For Overt, Nasser refactored the refresher specs to use the EMS refresh helper method in core. Overt had essentially an earlier version of the methods which did a full database comparison. But since the core method had updates for which columns we should ignore, it was causing some spec failures when we added a new timestamp column. So Nasser was able to delete the older version of that method in Overt and convert it over to use the core method. For Redfish, we fixed a bug where the service URL that we were building wasn't working if you picked SSL no validation. Essentially, the issue was it was not looking for the proper string, and so ended up causing it to build the URL without any scheme. So the URL it tried to hit was just : / and then the username, or sorry, then the host name. So we fixed that up to correctly recognize that it was using HTTPS. And for VMware, we set the last refresh success date. Since VMware uses streaming refresh, it doesn't use the same refresher method from core. So we had to set this separately. This is something that we'll hopefully refactor in the future so that all providers can use the same base manager refresher methods. And that is it for providers. Over to Joe.
Okay, so for platform enhancements, Russell added the delete collection API to Cube client. So you could call delete pods or delete nodes, etc., to delete all instances of a specific type in a namespace. Jeffrey added schema and product feature changes to enable removing the services explorer. Adam added a method to return the components of an HTTP proxy URI as a hash, as some providers need this information, and we already had it, so why should we reparse the URI? As a bug enhancement, Keenan enhanced our support ? Test stubbing to solve a problem for callers who called that support ? Multiple times in a test, either intentionally or something else that was calling it. And it was actually stubbing it every time. and they actually wanted to stop just the first invocation and call the original code subsequently. Next slide. For platform bugs, Adam fixed a sporadic test failure caused by changes to the shared state, the log level, by resetting it during the teardown of the test. Keenan fixed a problem where we had expectations in the UI regarding an alert profile's description length. He added a explicit 255 length validation in the model, so we don't rely on the UI for that. Keenan continued his work on moving from the availability mixin to supports. He converted the last few remaining uses of the mixin and was able to remove it. Adam also updated some of the IPMI checks to use the correct supports API and to also put those checks before we actually do IPMI operations. Jason fixed an issue where an async task for widget data already existed and was returning true instead of the actual task ID that we were using for tracking the task's completion. He also fixed another issue that could occur in development with synchronous widget generation. Gilbert fixed an issue where the Ansible machine credentials model definition didn't include the required credential type field. As Jeffrey already mentioned, Frank, Melody, and I updated the backend translation to pull in fixes for incorrect strings that weren't previously exposed for translation, and to update the message catalogs with the latest strings. I added a change to enforce the minimum rack version for security fixes. This version was already supported and in use in our builds, but wasn't required. Now it's the minimum version. Jason fixed issues where the images created by Podman on S390X were not in the correct V2 image format. That was causing issues later when creating multi-architecture image manifests. Next slide, and on to Keenan for the REST API.
Hi, all. Cool. Okay. So at least in the enhancement, I think the other one might have been a remnant, but either way, the task ID. So we had, or Jason had updated the way that async widget refreshes work. And so we just reflected that on the front end. And I think this might even be old for the refactoring. That's most of our work for this week. That's all for this slide. On to the next slide.
Cool, that's it. So thanks everybody. The next sprint review, sprint 190, will be on June 29th. Again, the meeting time is 9:30. And I just want to thank everyone in the community, all the contributors. This week, the testers were doing a lot, trying to find bugs. So we appreciate everyone, and we'll see you next time.